This month we want to explore the misconceptions surrounding water retention and the medical advice to avoid salt, as well as the overprescription of diuretics, with special reference to toxemia of late pregnancy, and the role of inflammation and poor energy reserves as a cause for concern. We're going to be joined here by Dr. Ray Peat here in a couple of minutes, but you're listening to Ask Your Herb Doctor on KMUD Garberville 91.1 FM, and from 7:30 until the end of the show, at 8 o'clock, you're invited to call in with any questions, either related or unrelated to this month's topic of salt, inflammation and diuretics. The number here, if you live in the area, is 923-3911, or if you live outside the area, the toll-free number is 1-800-568-3723. So that's 1-800-KMUD-RAD. And this is the last show for this year, for 2011, and we'll be with you back again in 2012. Okay, so hopefully Dr. Peat will be with us. I think actually it looks like they're still trying to get him on the line here. So this month's show, again, as I said, is going to be mainly looking at the topics of salt avoidance with respect to water retention, and opening up that misconception with facts and science supporting the use of salt rather than the avoidance of salt for decreasing water retention, and also look at Dr. Tom Brewer's research work, pioneering research work on toxemia of late pregnancy. So for those women that are listening, probably a very noteworthy part of the show will be based on that toxemia and the things that Dr. Brewer have proved to reduce swelling and actually reduce the actual occurrence of toxemia completely. His diet was very instrumental in making that a new way of looking at toxemia, because pretty much the medical advice for women with toxemia was actually counterintuitive in many cases. So hopefully Dr. Peat's with us on the show. Hi, Dr. Peat.
Hi.
Okay, so once again, Dr. Peat's joining us to illuminate the way, as it were, then through the misconceptions that we so often repeat as truth. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Peat. Again, would you please describe your academic and professional background for listeners maybe new to the show who perhaps have never heard your name?
I studied biology, physiology at the University of Oregon, and have taught various hormone and nutrition-related courses, as well as in other fields, psychology and philosophy included.
Okay, so your main interests, I know, have been around the looking into hormones, and much of your research has given you new insights into the treatment of many situations and conditions with hormones like progesterone and pregnenolone and others. In terms of the, I think perhaps we should start with something like modern diuretics. So we come into contact with people that, for one reason or another, are using diuretics to decrease water retention, whether it's ankles, fingers, or cardiac water retention. Is there any safe diuretics that you know of that are prescription medications in terms of the way that they act?
Yeah, there are some that are relatively safe, but it's the whole theory behind why they exist that is the problem. Mercury compounds used to be used. Basically, they just kill the kidney cells and let stuff leak out. And they were the common diuretics for a very long time until the 1950s. New compounds came on the market that had a variety of effects on the kidneys, and it was really the promotion of those that created an ideology that diuretics are really the key to treating heart disease and several other problems such as toxemia of pregnancy. But really, I think it's mostly a marketing strategy to orient physiology around making the kidneys leak out more water. The real problem is what causes the water retention, and almost anything that seriously injures the organism causes water retention. Like a problem following surgery very often is that the person stops forming urine, and shock, any very serious sickness is going to, in many ways, cause the reduced ability to form urine properly. And it's sort of a plumber's approach to physiology to think of just opening up the kidneys and letting the liquid out faster.
So from a herbal perspective, dandelion leaf and the root is a little bit less effective than the dandelion leaf, but it works as a diuretic, and that's what I thought they had created furosemide from. Although then with furosemide, I know you have to have a prescription of potassium along with it, and dandelion leaf, or most green leaves, have a lot of potassium, so it just kind of works out that you don't need to take potassium if you use dandelion leaf as a diuretic. But would you consider furosemide as a safe diuretic?
It's got a long history of use, and it probably does have an actual beneficial effect on survival. But with almost any leaf extract, the potassium and magnesium are going to have a diuretic effect that is probably safer than the actual function on the kidneys.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay, so the inflammation in the first place is the main cause in many cases for the cessation of diuresis and the increase in water retention in the cells through damage.
So you're saying that it's much more important to look at what's causing that inflammation, trying to get to the root of the problem, rather than just prescribe a diuretic.
Yeah, even before the inflammation, there's the energy problem. And something as simple as drinking too much water in relation to the energy your body is producing. For example, a low thyroid person who can't produce much metabolic energy is very susceptible to drinking too much water and getting a very general disruption of their physiology. A pint or so of water passing suddenly through your stomach to your intestine causes a surge of serotonin release. And that's simply a model of stress or shock in general. Anything that shocks you or stresses you tends to start the same process, but just a surge of water hitting the intestine is enough to increase serotonin, which then stimulates the production of prolactin, and prolactin is associated with water retention. Serotonin itself is, in a direct way, and serotonin increases the production of aldosterone, which produces water retention and inflammation, and sets off a chain of reactions that lead to such things as heart failure.
And the unfortunate thing is when someone is low thyroid, they're usually very, very thirsty all the time anyway, so they crave that water and they think they have to have that water in order, because they say their body's really craving it.
Yeah, it causes the tissues to retain water, even though it's passing through them, through the kidneys mostly, and they aren't producing much evaporation through their lungs or skin. but it tends to leak out of their bloodstream into the tissues and produce edema. And edema is harmful to all of the tissues in a direct way. It turns on a whole anabolic system, shifting away from oxidative metabolism, activating lipolysis, the release of fatty acids, shifting cell metabolism towards burning fat rather than sugar, imitating diabetes and aging. So it's a generalized shock physiology that's involved when cells get waterlogged. It can start with low thyroid, but it feeds back and makes the low thyroid problem worse.
So that's why you said that even if any kind of leaf extract or, tea made from a leaf of a plant is going to have minerals in it that help prevent this from happening. And if you sip on, if you made a cup of tea, you'd sip on it slowly. You wouldn't just drink it down like a pint of water.
And the minerals, it isn't essential that it be magnesium and potassium. Calcium and sodium have many of the same functions, even though each thing has its place in the mechanisms. If you're in shock, you can relieve the symptoms pretty much by taking more of any one of the alkaline minerals, potassium, sodium, magnesium, or calcium. In heart failure and lung inflammation, many of the things that happen with shock or aging or any serious disease, the lungs and the heart tend to get waterlogged and lose function. Just giving a very concentrated salt solution intravenously will relieve the symptoms very often. They've doubled the survival or cut the mortality rate in half by just giving extra sodium intravenously.
Now, why? It's a very interesting point that you've just opened up there, because that begs the question: why is it so often that doctors tell people to avoid salt? And why is salt so maligned heavily as a problem element? Especially when they are swelling, and then here they're using it in surgery. So, I mean...
It really, I think, got its big boost around 1950 when the diuretics came on the market. Mm-hmm. They found the diuretics took sodium out at the same time they took water out.
Right.
And so they said you should get the same effect by restricting the sodium intake. And they applied that to pregnant women, and Tom Brewer and some other people wrote about the horrible effects of sodium restriction in pregnancy, plus using diuretics. if you combine the two, you get
doubly bad
serious effects.
Yeah. Okay.
After I had been reading Tom Brewer's work for a long time, I was seeing similarities between premenstrual syndrome and the toxemia of pregnancy that he had worked on. And I finally decided to suggest to young women who were having premenstrual water retention and not having any good results just by stopping their salt intake, I suggested that they follow Brewer's prescription to increase their salt intake when they were having edema, water retention problems, and to go according to their craving for salt rather than avoiding the craving. The first person that tried it just had a total avoidance of premenstrual water retention the very first month she tried it.
And how much salt did she?
Quite a lot.
What, like a teaspoon a couple times a day, or
well,
quarter
she just
teaspoon?
shook it on, even if the food was already salted, she would just
add more.
Lots more onto it. And just absolutely stopped right from then on, never had a water retention problem again.
I wonder, do you know why, or where the mechanism for which doctors will tell you that salt is, it causes, it could increase the risk of stroke, heart attack, and just generally very bad for your cardiovascular system, and so people should avoid salt at all costs. So where do you think that mistaken ideologies come from?
David McCarran, 30 or 40 years ago, was studying the issue, and he looked at the figures that the government published that recommendation was based on. And he saw that if you look at the figures carefully, the people who eat the least salt had the highest blood pressure, and the people who ate the most salt had the lowest blood pressure. And he saw what the figures really showed that led to misinterpretation was that low calcium intake was associated with the hypertension. And the sodium was really there sort of as an innocent bystander associated with the calcium deficiency.
So you're saying that calcium deficiency is more responsible for hypertension?
David McCarran, I think, has probably written maybe 150 articles on the subject.
Okay.
I think he was at Stanford or some California university when he started saying it's not high sodium, it's low calcium that causes hypertension. And I think that university invited him to leave.
Oh, no, isn't this, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but am I thinking right when you've mentioned in the past that low calcium intakes cause calcium to leak out of the bones and into the blood, and that causes the calcification of the arteries eventually, which gives you the hypertension? Is that part of the mechanism?
Yeah, that's the essential idea.
Yeah.
The low calcium intake, among other things, increases your parathyroid hormone, which pulls calcium out of your bones and favors its movement into cells of all kinds. And when calcium is taken up by cells, it stimulates them and tends to make them contract. And that's one of the places that thyroid and energy production comes into the question, because carbon dioxide produced by the action of thyroid, carbon dioxide keeps calcium out of cells. Even if you breathe in a bag and increase your carbon dioxide, or take baking soda or whatever, the carbon dioxide will relax your blood vessels by helping the calcium to move out of the blood vessels and back into the bones.
Okay, so even are you thinking along the lines of even relatively short-term exposure to higher blood levels of calcium and or tissues, endothelia, picking up the calcium can contribute to that lack of elasticity that will be more is that more characteristic of high blood pressure and hypertension?
Each of these things sets in motion a whole sequence of events. The low carbon dioxide, which lets calcium get into cells and excite them and tighten up the blood vessels, for example.
Okay.
Low carbon dioxide also lets the platelets release their serotonin, and the serotonin, besides adding to the tension of the blood vessels, makes them permeable and leaky, so that the water isn't retained in the bloodstream but leaks through into the cells. And the cells that are taking up calcium are also taking up water.
So basically 2,000 milligrams of calcium is a really important thing for somebody with hypertension to start implementing into their regime.
Yeah, and supporting it with the other minerals. The facts that David McCarran looked at showed that this inverse connection between salt and blood pressure. The high salt eaters actually had lower blood pressure. And one of the things that is involved there is that sodium helps the cell, stimulates the cell to expel calcium. The sodium activates the thyroid function, and the thyroid function pushes calcium out of the cell and lets the cell relax.
Oh, right, because I know you've mentioned the relaxation effect from thyroid, so that's also a direct. I
know it's a little bit confusing probably for our listeners with this, talking about calcium inside and outside of cells, but basically the salt helps to put the calcium where it should be and not being deposited in the your arteries, in the cells in your arteries. So I'm just trying to make that a little bit more understood there.
Okay, well, you're listening to Ask Your Herb Doctor on KMUD, Garberville, 91.1 FM, and from 7:30 until the end of the show, at 8 o'clock, you're invited to call in with any questions either related or unrelated to this month's topic of salt, inflammation and diuretics. The number here, if you live in the area, is 923-3911, or if you live outside the area, the toll-free number is 1-800-KMUD-RAD. And we're pleased once again to have Dr. Raymond Peat to join us and to bring out some of the misconceptions that we all have in the past. And one of those misconceptions is that salt is bad for you and salt will increase your heart attack or give you stroke, and that salt is not what you need if you've got swelling and edema, but actually, as we're finding out, salt is very important to decrease edema. Hi, Dr. Peat. Thanks for doing that. I think there was a pretty bad hiss on the line, so hopefully it's going to be clear now.
Yeah, no, that sounds much better. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so getting back to the diet that Tom Brewer brought about for the treatment of toxemia of late pregnancy, and a diet which actually resulted in none of his hundreds, if not thousands of clients or patients who were pregnant ever getting toxemia. He was very big on drinking quite a bit of milk was part of his diet. And
well, there's the calcium, keeping the calcium.
Yeah.
Also salt and lots of protein, right? Are those the main things that he was suggesting?
Yeah, he was talking about the protein and adding salt to your food, but the milk has other things besides the protein. The calcium has its direct effect on blood pressure, and the sugar of milk, it has its diuretic-like action. So the calcium and sugar add to the quality of the protein.
Now, we talked a little bit about we mentioned furosemide as a diuretic. Are there any safer, effective diuretics that we wouldn't perhaps think of diuretics, perhaps?
If you think of the sequence of stress effects that I mentioned, too much water leading to too much serotonin and aldosterone and prolactin.
Which are all inflammatory. Sorry to interrupt, but those are all inflammatory compounds.
Yeah, and cause water retention. And if you choose your substances with reference to inhibiting any or all of those, that's going to be an anti-edema,
right,
anti-inflammatory diet or treatment. Thyroid and progesterone, for example, right, lower all of these things.
Right.
Progesterone is a very powerful antagonist to aldosterone. And drugs are being developed to be very similar to progesterone, but to be patentable, so they can sell them to treat heart failure and water retention and inflammation and so on.
Do they not have the same effect as the progesterone?
Enough that they'll cure heart failure and such, but they have their own side effects.
Right.
They're just trying to make them as similar to progesterone as they can to minimize the side effects. But using any of the natural steroids derived from pregnenolone, right. Either progesterone or DHEA, yeah. Will help with water retention and edema and heart failure and so on.
Right, and that's because they're antagonizing the effects of aldosterone.
Yeah.
And aldosterone is causing the inflammation and the water retention.
Yeah, and aldosterone increases, besides inflammation, it leads to fibrosis and prolonged heart failure and vascular and kidney disease and so on lead to fibrosis, lung disease. Everywhere that water retention and inflammation start, they tend to end up with fibrosis. Okay. And so 60 or 70 years ago, a researcher, Lipschutz, called pregnenolone and progesterone the anti-fibromatogenic steroids. They start out inhibiting fibrous overproduction, okay, and end up protecting against tumors.
Wow.
Okay, we'll try calling Dr. Peat back.
Hello?
Hi, caller, you're on the air.
Yeah, this is topical. Your discussion on calcium. I don't know if you want to go into specifics, but I'll give you a short story. About 9 months ago, I was in ICU for a week and a half because my calcium went crazy. I was later diagnosed with sarcoidosis. Mm-hmm. And my doctor wants me to get down on my calcium level.
So you're saying that your calcium level was high when
yes,
you...
very high.
Right.
And it shut down my kidneys,
right,
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
That was 9-10 months ago.
Okay.
I once a month I do a calcium level check.
Right.
Blood test.
Do you know what your calcium is?
Huh?
Do you know what your calcium value is?
Doggone, I wish I knew the number. But the problem is he's got me on 15 milligrams of prednisone.
Oh dear.
To keep my calcium level down, and I love milk.
Yeah, well, the prednisone, I'm sure, is because
I know, I hate prednisone.
Yeah, as an anti-inflammatory steroid, so because of sarcoids and inflammatory, quote.
So I know that caused the issue, but I think he's using the prednisone to keep the calcium levels down. But the way you talk, sounds like calcium levels are a pretty good idea.
Well, calcium, not in the blood, but in the bones, which is where the calcium should be. So consuming adequate dietary calcium in the form of powdered eggshells or consuming dairy in the form of milk, getting about 2,000 milligrams of calcium a day will actually let you store the calcium in your bones. And
that's what I do.
And prevent it from being in your bloodstream, which is what happens when you don't take up enough dietary calcium. So when you said your blood levels were high, that's because your bones were allowing the calcium that was in the bones to leak out into your blood supply, and that's caused more of the problem. But the best way to lower your blood calcium would be to intake in enough dietary calcium.
Okay.
Now,
and that does help. Blood pressure is affected that way as well?
Yeah, well, that would also cause what Dr. Peat was talking about with calcium, is that calcium in the endothelia, which is the tissue within the lining of the arterial, the arteries and the arterioles, the vascular supply that's under high pressure, that is actually made more stretchy and elastic by not having calcium taken up into it, which happens when there's too much calcium in the blood and not enough in the bones. Your body, through parathyroid, starts to pull out calcium from the bone and
we want to do the reverse.
Exactly. So making sure you have a high enough dietary intake of calcium will be the
which
best.
Would be a lot of dairy products.
Well, it doesn't have to be dairy products. Dairy products are very good, and we do recommend milk intake.
Protein?
No, 4 to 6. Dealing with dairy, 4 to 6 glasses of whole milk if you're not overweight, or 2% if you don't want the fat so much.
Right.
But
I do.
One of the other best ways of achieving high calcium in your dietary intake will be capsules of powdered eggshell. So,
Oh, really?
yeah, I mean, what Dr. Peat's always talked about in the past is taking your eggshells and just washing them out, washing that membrane out from the inside, storing them till you have 10 or a dozen or so, and then putting them in the oven at about 350 on a baking tray, a cookie sheet. And then put them into a coffee grinder, an electric coffee grinder.
Got it. Okay.
And then that resulting powder, you can take about a half a teaspoon a day, will give you
about a quarter teaspoon 3 times a day is just over 2,000 milligrams. So.
Yeah. So that 2,000 milligrams of calcium there will be very beneficial in terms of decreasing your blood calcium, but increasing your uptake of calcium into your bones.
And we've seen this with our clients. We've seen that they have a high calcium level in their blood.
Yeah, but maybe I won't.
Okay, so just one last thing I'll tell you, and then we'll move on to the next caller. What we've seen is when people have high calcium in their blood, it's because they're not getting enough in their diet. And when they start supplementing their diet with a higher calcium level, like closer to 2,000 milligrams, 2,000 milligrams is about 2 quarts of milk. Or we told you about the eggshell, a quarter teaspoon 3 times a day is about 2,000 milligrams, or you can do some of both. But then you'll see the blood calcium.
Okay, you're on hold? Okay.
The blood calcium level come down to a normal range, which is around 9. The number's
I'll definitely try the eggshells. I'm 75 years old, and the sarcoidosis, whatever it is, definitely puts me on the fritz.
The other thing that you should do in conjunction with that is actually supplement with a vitamin D supplement.
All right, I've got that.
Yeah, the calcium and vitamin D work fairly synergistically, so.
Yeah, I had kind of a reverse opinion. I thought less was best.
Well, no, because you want to bring your blood levels down by making sure
put it back to the bone. Give it back to the bone.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
All right, so thank you very much. I'll let the next caller go.
Thank you for your call.
Thank you for your call.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, you're on the air?
Hello.
Hi, you're on the air.
Hi, it's your normal engineer.
Oh, hi.
How are you doing?
So I got chicken pox, which is going around.
Oh, dear.
And I was wondering if, some I was wondering what your recommendation would be. And also, I had learned from you guys that coconut fat is antiviral.
Yes.
So I'm actually using that as a salve on my sores, and I was wondering if you thought that was a good idea.
Yeah, and internal would be good.
Oh, yeah, I'm drinking a ton of coconut milk, too.
Yeah, internally.
Okay,
so you've never had chicken pox before, then? Okay, then now's your first time. How bad is it?
I think I've been told it's going to get worse. I've only had it for a day.
Right, because in adults it's generally more severe, they say, than in children. Yeah, from a point of view of anti-infectives at this point, being a viral situation, I don't know how much can be done that quickly. I think your own body will certainly get on top of it. I don't think there's anything per se that's going to really knock it back now that you're coming out with it. In terms of your skin and the lesions there, then there'll be things that you can do to kind of minimize the itching, which is probably one of the main symptoms of the chicken pox.
Not yet, but that's what I've heard.
Yeah, well, when the vesicles burst, they're kind of fluid filled, and when they burst, they'll then become quite itchy because that's a condition. It's just like shingles and herpes, the same kind of varicella zoster. It's the same kind of family, so they all have this kind of weeping characteristic where the fluid fills vesicles burst and then they get very itchy. So in England, I know that calamine lotion is not exactly herbal, but calamine lotion was a fairly good, soothing, calming topical application.
What is calamine lotion if it's not herbal?
You know what? I'm not sure what calamine is. I could probably you could probably look it up. You could Google it, I'm sure. But it's basically a liquid that you will put on with cotton wool, damp cotton wool, and rub it on, dab it on the skin in those areas that are particularly itchy. I'm trying to think if there would be anything else that would be more systemic that you could use as a antipruritic, to stop the itch. Maybe if we get Dr. Peat back on, he'll have some suggestions, but
okay.
I'm afraid the engineer's wrestling with the phone, but Dr. Peat is still out of action at this point in time, so I don't quite know what's happened.
Well, I'll keep listening. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I feel bad for you. I hope you have a happy Christmas anyway, despite this, because it's probably going to be another 7 to 10 days, I think, before it's kind of getting resolved. But
yeah, that's what I hear.
I'll ask Dr. Peat as and when we get him back on the air to see what his advice would be, but I'm sure calamine lotion could be something that you could look up, and I think that's as a topical application, that would be pretty good. I know that he'll probably mention other things that would probably be better. So let's just see if we can get him back with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and Happy New Year and Happy Christmas, huh?
Thanks.
Okay, Dr. Pete, we've got Dr. Pete back on the line yet? We don't have Dr. Pete back on the line. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on. Do we have any more callers on the line?
Yes, I had a question. You were talking about the CO2 levels, and I have been studying a little bit the Buteyko method, which is some exercise which will actually increase the CO2 levels.
Okay, good.
And, as you mentioned, it can increase the relaxation, and for me, it helps with things like insomnia. And I'm curious in relation to what you're talking about. I didn't quite get the full picture of what the CO2 levels, like raising those CO2 levels, what impact that might have.
Right. Okay, well, Dr. Pete's talked fairly extensively about the benefits of CO2. I think most of us always associate CO2 as a poisonous gas that we need to get rid of by exhaling, when actually I think the truth in the science is that oxygen itself is probably more poisonous than CO2, and CO2 in its own right is actually very anti-inflammatory and actually associated with greater longevity. Peoples and cultures that live at high altitudes, like the Tibetans and the people in the Peruvian Andes, have actually much greater health records. Actually have much less inflammatory disease. They have way less cancer incidences, and generally the inflammation is much less amongst the communities at high elevation because of the beneficial effects of CO2. Dr. Pete has mentioned several times the method by which you can just bag breathe. You get a brown paper bag and sit down in a chair and relax and just breathe in and out, rebreathing your own CO2. Now, this is also a very good way of increasing CO2 levels. So I think the main effects were the anti-inflammatory, anti-stress effects of breathing in CO2, and also the longevity effects that do come with it are well documented.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Bye.
Okay. Are there any more calls on the line? Okay. Hi, you're on the air?
So I just had a recommendation for the...
Hello? There was a caller there, but they suddenly disappeared.
Dr. Pete, are you on the line?
No, I don't think the caller is there. Okay, well, Sarah, how about you?
So,
Hello? It's a meltdown in the studio.
You're doing a good job there, engineer. Just there's a bit of a problem here. We had a fuzzy connection to start with Dr. Pete on the line, and then
we cut him off.
Well,
okay.
Bag breathing is another way that you can help to lower since we've been talking about high blood pressure. Bag breathing is also very good to help lower someone's blood pressure because it helps with that CO2 and putting calcium in the right place. So that's another use for that.
And we talked about the anti-stress effects and the anti-edema effects of increased CO2 as well. And that the high elevation civilizations also had way less stress and way less inflammatory diseases.
So I wonder if they have less heart disease. That'd be an interesting epidemiological study.
Well, you're listening to Ask Your Herb Doctor on KMUD Garberville 91.1 FM. And from now till the end of the show at 8 o'clock, people are invited to call in with any questions either related or unrelated to this month's topic of salt, inflammation and diuretics. The number here, if you live in the area, is 923-3911, or if you live outside the area, the number's 1-800-KMUD-RAD. So if there are any people that have been listening to the show, would like to call in with any questions, please feel free to do so now. Otherwise, we're going to still see if we can get Dr. Pete back on the air.
Hello?
Hi, you're on the air.
Yeah, so I've been listening to the show today, and it all sounded very interesting to me, but I'm curious how it could pertain to athletes. It seems like diuretics, salt, calcium, all very critical in sport. I don't know if you've been able to get the doctor back on.
I think they're still working at it. But what was your main question in relation to the topic in sport?
Well, yeah, I always have to calculate things like sweat loss to then calculate how much I need to intake during sport. I particularly practice a lot of running and cycling sports, and I was curious how to calculate salt, how much salt intake I should be taking.
Okay, well, how much do you take in generally?
Well, all my supplements, usually they're sports supplements, have a certain amount of sodium in them, and I take the recommended dosages of those, whether they're, 2 scoops of the product to 20 ounces of water per hour. But again, I don't know if that's the adequate amount or if the doctor is saying that maybe we should be taking higher levels of sodium.
Well, I do know that there's been a study that's been done with baking soda showing that athletes performed better when they took up to a tablespoon of baking soda in one day. Spread out, obviously, because you don't want to be diluting your stomach acid when you're trying to digest some proteins with a meal. But that's because it increases their CO2, and as an athlete, you're blowing off a lot of CO2 when you're exercising, especially with all that heavy aerobic exercise. And it would be very good for you to have constant, almost like you want an IV of glucose while you're exercising, IV of glucose and all these minerals, so that you don't put your body into a stressed state, and you'll actually cope better with the endurance exercise.
Okay. So in reference to CO2, am I actually looking to put my body in a slightly more hypoxic state?
Yeah, because, you are you're over-oxygenating yourself when you're doing aerobic exercise because you're blowing off so much CO2.
Which is actually a very negative thing to do. But.
In effect, the carbon dioxide is pulling more oxygen through your cell system.
Did the caller hear that? Have we got the caller and you on the line?
I'm still on the line.
Good. Could you hear Dr. Pete?
I didn't hear what he said, no.
You didn't.
Okay, sorry, Dr. Pete, can you repeat that a little?
Yeah, the carbon dioxide acts as if it's pulling more oxygen into the cell system. It activates the electron transport chain to use oxygen more quickly and effectively.
So that is what would happen when this athlete would take baking soda?
Yeah. They've done it with endurance races, giving them a tablespoon of baking soda at the start of the race. And you would think that it would make them more alkaline. Alkaline is not a necessarily good state. The carbon dioxide actually enters the cell and becomes an acidic form from the baking soda bicarbonate. Momentarily makes your blood more alkaline, but the absorbed carbon dioxide becomes acidic inside the cell, and the intracellular state should be slightly on the acid side when the oxygen is really working. They call it oxygen because it means acid former, and the acid that it makes is carbon dioxide, and in that slightly acidic state, oxygen is having its full action for producing energy. And it's that same energy production which takes the calcium out of the cell and lets the cell relax and recuperate properly. If you aren't producing or retaining enough carbon dioxide, the cell will begin making lactic acid, and the lactic acid leaves the cell in an alkaline, stressed condition. Even though it's acidifying the blood, it's leaving the cell in a stressed alkaline condition that causes inflammation. So too much aerobic exercise becomes catabolic and inflammatory.
Right. Caller, so are you there? Caller, did you hear what Dr. Pete had said?
Yes, I did.
Perfect.
Very good information. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Do you have anything else you wanted to say?
No.
Don't want to cut you off.
Thank you very much for answering my question.
Okay, you're very welcome. All right, so I think we have 2 more callers here, so let's take them one at a time and see if we can get through them before we get close to the top of the hour. You're on the air, caller.
Hello, am I on?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, I have a suggestion and also a question for Dr. Pete. I live in Laytonville, and last year I discovered a product down in Willits at Mariposa that is incredible for itching, and I got it for poison oak. And it's called Manzanita Magic, and it comes in a 3-ounce bottle. It is wild-crafted manzanita, grapefruit, plantain, chickweed, organic sage, thyme, and cayenne. And it's a dark liquid, and I'm just wondering if that would work for chickenpox.
Yeah, I wonder.
And that's just my suggestion. My question is...
Well, let me just say one thing quickly about that. That's a wonderful product, and I know the lady who makes it, and that's a really good idea. So thanks for calling in and letting us know that. And, Michael, if you're still listening, get yourself some Manzanita Magic. Terry makes it.
Did you mention aspirin for chickenpox?
No, we didn't. So I would like you to talk about that if you would.
But the call, let's
let
the caller
my
finish.
Question, and then I'll get off the line. It's about calcium and getting it back into your bones. I've been dealing with breast cancer since 2005 and had to really pay attention to trying to keep calcium in my bones. And I would like to know, my understanding is that it's specifically vitamin D3 that assists with calcium going into the bones. And I'd like Dr. Peat to comment on that and also on the ratio of calcium and magnesium that he might recommend. And I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you.
Thank you for your call. Dr. Peat, did you hear that question?
The ratio isn't as big an issue as a lot of books say. If you're getting a little excess sodium and calcium, it spares the magnesium. The sodium and calcium activate cell respiration, and cell respiration is needed for cells to retain magnesium. So if you're low in sodium and calcium, you depend on a good thyroid function to retain magnesium. So any stress that increases aldosterone, for example, is going to make you lose magnesium. So keeping your aldosterone and inflammation down, your thyroid, calcium, and sodium up is going to make you retain magnesium much more efficiently.
All right, we got 3 callers and 5 minutes.
Well, we won't get that done in 5 minutes. But first, let's go back. Dr. Peat, would you first give some more suggestions for Michael, our engineer, who's got chickenpox at the moment?
Okay. Aspirin has been found to have a mild antiviral effect against several types of virus. Someone with AIDS sent me an old publication that they had begun a trial of aspirin for HIV-infected people, and they were getting good results when they discontinued the study. But it has been proven somewhat effective for several different kinds of virus, including the herpes or chickenpox type.
Yeah.
And Michael, call us. We'll give our number out at the end of the show in case you don't have it, and we'll help direct you with the amount of vitamin K you need to take in order to use aspirin safely. And also another thing, Dr. Peat, can you please comment about vitamin D for that lady with the calcium? She wanted to know why the vitamin D was so important.
If you're having blood tests, it's good to have your vitamin D3 in the upper part of the normal range. And it would also be good to have the parathyroid hormone checked. When you're getting enough vitamin D and calcium, you will inhibit the parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone, although it has its place, you don't want it to be chronically elevated.
Because it's a cancer promoter.
Yeah.
And we have another 3 callers on the line. Let's at least take one. We've got 2 minutes left here.
We're getting lots of stress here in the studio, and it's 1 minute to 8.
It's hilarious.
So I'm sorry, caller, to have cut you short with that recommendation that for everybody's sanity, we need to make sure that we close the show at 8 o'clock, pronto. And thank you so much for all those people that have called in and Thank you, engineer, for dealing with the stress associated with losing callers. And our beloved Dr. Peat, thank you so much for joining us again.
Okay.
And we're just going to give out some contact details.
Yeah, contact details for Dr. Raymond Peat. Visit his website, please, www.raypeat.com. That's raypeat.com. Lots of scholarly articles, fully referenced scientific literature. It's open your eyes, folks, and go and take a look at what he's got on the website. That'll refute a lot of the misconceptions. Thank you to all those people that have phoned in.